Okay, excellent. Right, so let's get cracking. So, oh, by the way, we're aiming for just under an hour in total, but some of that will be for questions. So just to sort of manage your expectations there. Okay, so right, how do we interview? What's the sort of the process? Well, it's important to note how we interview and how we use interviews is part of a holistic process. In other words, we take quite a lot of data on you. And by the way, everything I'm saying just now applies equally to Cambridge University. So if you're not applying to Oxford, it'll count the same. Also, quite a lot of what I'll mention will have some relevance to medical schools, although it's worth checking because not all medical schools apply the same sort of rubrics. Anyway, preamble short. When we interview people, it's not like the boss level of a computer game. It's not like you fought your way all the way up to Bowser and now you've got to defeat Bowser and then you get into the castle. We take all of the data that we've considered about you into consideration at the same time. Okay, so what that means is that you could actually have a relatively poor performance at interview, as in compared to some other interviewees, but you could absolutely still be admitted because of tremendous strengths elsewhere in your application. And so this should hopefully manage your expectations of the interview. A lot of people go into the interview thinking, right, here's my 25 minutes or so to prove myself, and if something goes a little bit sideways, it's over. You know, the whole process has been completely doomed. No, it's not like that. The stakes are not that high. We do use all of the data holistically. Okay, so there's not much need to be overstressed. You can see with the graphic on the top of the screen the various bits of data that we tend to lean on, which includes, you know, academic achievement, so that's your school grades, any admissions test data that we may have taken, any written work that you might have submitted, which is not for all subjects. We look at your UCAS personal statement, we look at your UCAS school reference, and we look at interviews, right? So we look at everything in the round, right? So that should hopefully make the whole process not quite so sort of stress-inducing. Okay, now what are we doing in the interview? Well, we're assessing your academic ability and potential. And specifically how we do this in Oxford and Cambridge is that we recreate the way that we teach. So it's a bit like an audition for the way we teach. So in Oxford, we teach in small classes called tutorials. In Cambridge, they do exactly the same thing, but they call them supervisions. And the interview is just giving you a taste of what that's like. So it's a teaching moment. It's not like a job interview. So it's not going to be asking you questions like, why did you apply to this college? Or, you know, tell us something about yourself, right? There's not going to be small talk. There's not going to be many questions about your experiences. It's going to be a lesson, basically. It's going to be us giving you a really complex puzzle, and we will help you work through that puzzle, okay? So I think if you frame it in your mind more as a lesson than as an interview in the classic sense, that might be helpful because it'll help you understand what's likely to come up. Okay, within that process, we'll also be gauging, you know, do you know what you've signed up for, right? You know, if you're applying to study law, for example, and we give you a piece of legislation to read, you know, a little extract from legislation, you know, are you going to find that interesting? Does it look like you have ever come across legislation before in your life, right? You know, given that you'll be reading legislation as a law student every day, right? You know, it's fairly reasonable of us to sort of say, are you aware of that, by the way? You know, do you know what you're signing yourself up for? Similarly, for something like medicine, we ask medical science questions because you're going to do a lot of medical science as a medical student. We're not going to ask you questions like, why do you want to be a doctor? Or do you have any work experience, right? We are going to ask you stuff that gives us a sense that you know what you signed up for. Okay, that will also give us clues as to whether you're motivated to study, right? I have a bit of a litmus test when I'm interviewing prospective undergraduates. Can I see this person getting up at 9 a.m. in a hailstorm and going to a lecture? If I can't imagine that, then that's slightly troubling. Now, how do you sort of communicate that motivation? I mean, you don't want to paint on a big sort of cheeky grin and go, oh, I love maths, or whatever it is you're being interviewed for. You know, you don't want to fake it, in other words. But, you know, if you just relax and be yourself, and presumably you are in love with your chosen subject, and that's why you've chosen to apply for it, and that sort of sense of joy will just come across naturally. But don't feel like you have to be terribly serious, like you can never crack a smile, like you can never look like you're enjoying yourself, because actually it can be really helpful for us to see that you enjoy yourself. Okay, we will also just want to get a sense of whether you can solve the problems that we've given you, and to think critically. In other words, to think about other solutions to that problem that you're not you're not considering, or that you've chosen not to apply for whatever reason. Okay, but it's not crucially about how fast you solve the problem or whether you're the first person to get to the solution or anything like that. It's also not crucially about testing how much stuff you know. It's not sort of a test of your knowledge per se. There may be aspects in which we will draw on knowledge that you could reasonably be expected to have, but we're not going to sort of give you a pop quiz, right? And we're not going to ask you various things that are to do with what you might know, because I mean, for one important reason, we have students from all over the world, and so they will have been taught under all sorts of different syllabuses. Welcome everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much for coming along. Just to catch you up, my name's Matt. I'm from Oxford University, and we are just talking about Oxford interviews, of which I've conducted several hundred. If you have any questions as I'm going along, do just drop them in the chat. So let's give an example, right? So I've been talking very theoretically so far. Here's an actual example. This is a real past Oxford interview question for medicine, and it is, how would you measure the weight of your own head? Which is a super weird question, right? If I went up to someone in the street and asked them this, they would probably section me, right? So this is not the sort of small talk chit chat that you would ever expect. And hence, as I say, we use these sort of big mind-bending puzzles just to gauge, are you into this? Do you understand what medical sciences is all about? Do you know what you've signed up for? Are you motivated? And it's a lesson, right? It's like a class in medical science. So we'll be asking you, to think about various technical aspects about the scientific method, right? Because that's what this question is ultimately about. It's if you were to try and estimate the weight of your head, what method would you use? Okay, so we're going to have to break this down, right? So that the way to get into the interview is to start just thinking out loud, right? Remember, it's not a race to the finish, so I'm not expecting you to just sort of blurt out the answer, because clearly there is no single answer to this question. This is a really knotty problem for which there are several possible solutions. So we're going to look for you to just start thinking out loud, and then we're going to teach you, right? We're going to work with you to try and work out some solutions. So take a breath, get yourself relaxed, and then sort of say things that are coming into your mind. So you might sort of start by saying, well, okay, might have to work out first of all what my head even is, right? What counts as my head? Where does my head begin and end? If you don't mention that, the interviewers will help you get to that stage. They'll ask you to break down the question and to pick out various things. So they might say, what even is your head? Okay. So it might be a good idea to really focus on the question very carefully. I think the most common mistake I've seen in Oxford interviews is people not listening to me, not focusing on the question, right? I'm your best friend in that interview. I am the person who's trying to get you into Oxford. I am desperate to give you all of the information you need to have the best performance. I'm not your enemy. I'm not trying to sabotage your performance. I am your best friend. So you listen to everything I say and you work with me, and you'll likely do better. What tends to happen sometimes is that people just start giving me loads of facts and data just to show off how much stuff they've read, show off how clever they are, and they don't listen and they don't work with me. Okay, so that is honestly the most common mistake. So if I sort of start this interview by asking you, how would you measure the weight of your own head? You start thinking out loud, and then I would start saying things like, well, tell me a bit more about what your head is. Where would that begin and end? Where would you sort of start taking measurements from? Then we're on to a win, and then we're working together and we're having a bit of a lesson about it. Okay, you can come up with some slightly outlandish solutions. I've heard people. Sorry, I've got my son.
Some water.
Okay, sorry, bear with me. My sons are just in the kitchen. Jasper, can you get here? You want to close the door? Sorry. Where was I? Sometimes we have some slightly bonkers answers to these questions, and that's okay. I once heard someone say, oh, well, what I would do is cut off my head, and then in the last sort of millisecond of my life, I would measure its weight, which is, a slightly mad solution. It's fine, by the way, but I'll raise all sorts of problems with that. I'll sort of say things like, well, the weight of your head will change a lot as various sort of fluids come out of it. Anyway, I mean, I'm not wishing to be too graphic on a Tuesday evening, but I'll sort of gently push back, and I'll say, oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And in that process, I'm not saying, goodness me, you're totally wrong, you're way off track, you should be terribly ashamed of yourself. I'm your friend. I'm trying to help you, and you can go with me on that. You can say, oh yeah, maybe you're right, maybe a different approach would be better, or you can push back and you can say, oh no, I still think I would stick to my guns. You just need to work with me to try and find a solution, but you don't need to necessarily agree with everything I say, nor do you have to disagree with everything I say. There's some common sort of myths about Oxbridge interviews, that there's some sort of formula. Either you have to sort of stick to your guns and dig your heels in and never concede. And some people say the opposite, that you have to just immediately concede to whatever the interviewers are saying. Honestly, both is wrong. There's no formula. You just need to listen very carefully to the interview. You need to have an honest and open conversation with them, and you'll likely do fine. Okay, moving on. Here's another question. Would I be justified in saying that only morons play sport? Now, this is a slightly sort of rude interview question, because of course many of you might be keen sports people. This is actually a question from economics, slightly surprisingly. Now, what a question like this is doing is to try to sort of throw you off balance a bit. That's not to sort of make you feel stupid. It's not to make you feel anxious. It's just to sort of try and push you outside the box, right? Because a lot of people think in quite predictable ways. They've been taught to come up with the answer very quickly. But sometimes these problems are so messy and complicated, we want to sort of force you outside the box just to see how you would cope. Okay. And so what has this got to do with economics? Well, it's to try and gauge what you think about what's called rational choice theory and game theory. So whether or not people are rational if they take certain decisions. And the reason that we might conclude that only morons play sport is because you could argue that they take a relatively small benefit to quite an extraordinary amount of cost from partaking in sport. But then it becomes interesting as to, well, first of all, is that correct? And secondly, why would people do that if it was correct, right? So it's a really interesting sort of way of just getting into quite a complex field of economic science, but in a really sort of surprising manner, okay? So don't be sort of offended. Don't sort of think, I play loads of sport, I'm not a moron. The interviewers don't genuinely believe that morons play sport. They're just trying to sort of slightly throw you off balance. Honestly, these are the sorts of questions that end up in the papers, and we get in a lot of trouble because everyone sort of says, what is Oxford on about? They're just asking these crazy questions with no reason to it. There is a reason to it. It is just a way of gauging how you think and how you deal with complex ideas. And in the context of a teaching moment where we throw back and forth ideas, these sorts of mad questions make a lot more sense. Anyway, what is going on, or what could you expect from an interview? There are various sort of components, various sort of structural components to an interview that you could reasonably expect, that I'll go through first of all. So first of all, you may be asked to discuss your personal statement. And if that happens, it's likely to happen towards the start of the interview. The interview begins with just, very quick small talk along the lines of, hi, how are you? And then it will just go straight into an academic conversation. So there won't be much more small talk than that. But on occasions, you may be asked about your personal statement. So it's worth having a look back over your personal statement so that you can remember what you wrote in it. It absolutely can't be guaranteed that your personal statement will be brought up, but it's just a good idea to prepare yourself. If you are asked about your personal statement, you will be asked about any personal statements you made. In other words, any bits in your personal statement where you said, I think this, I concluded that, I believe the other, right? It's those bits where you express yourself is what we're most likely to be interested in. What we won't, in all likelihood, ask you is something like, oh, you appear to have read, Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. What does the character say on line 59? Right. We're not just going to give you a sort of knowledge-based pop quiz because it'd be such a pointless question, right? It wouldn't give me useful data on your academic ability and potential, and it would be impossible for me to compare you with the other interviewees, because unless they've all read Midsummer Night's Dream, I can't ask them the same question. So don't worry about that. It's not going to be something that along those lines, but they may ask you about your personal statement. Okay, you may also be asked to analyze some text or a graphic, or to solve a particular problem. You may in particular be given a bit of text in advance of the interview. So usually something in the order of half an hour before the interview itself, you're sent a bit of text. Now, for all of the Oxford interviews and for the vast majority of Cambridge interviews, these will all occur online, and you'll be given all of the instructions you need. So all of the instructions about whether to expect a text or not, and what to do about receiving that text and all the rest of it. If you have any instructions for the college along the lines of, I'm entitled to extra time in school exams because of, let's say, dyslexia, so please may I have some extra time, then you must make sure the college knows that, because they will be accommodating, but obviously they have to know in advance that you might need some of those special dispensations, okay? But it's not at all unusual, especially for things like English literature, to be given, say, a bit of poetry, and it'll be poetry that you've never come across in your life, because that's a better way to gauge your potential. Or for something like STEM subjects. So here's an example from political science, from politics, my own field, where we've got a graph that we would give you some time before the interview to have a look at. We wouldn't expect you to understand all of the details of the graph, so we would give you any information that you could reasonably need. So, for example, you might be aware of what GNP per cap means. And so we would give you a little glossary of key terms. So GNP per capita describes gross national product. So it's broadly speaking the wealth of the people of a nation. And so that's what's on the x-axis here. And then on the y-axis is proportion democratic in terms of countries. And so what is being shown on this graph is that as countries become richer, as in each of the people in a country are richer, more of those countries are democratic. Okay, and that's how, if you get a bit of text or if you get a graphic or something like that to interpret, the first questions in the interview will be something along the lines of, can you tell me what it says, right? They'll just be comprehension questions. So my opening questions would be for this graph, can you tell me what this graph shows? And if you can't tell, that's okay, because remember, we're recreating a lesson, right? So, you know, if you struggle to understand what the graph says, that's okay, right? Don't sort of panic and say, oh, I haven't got a clue. You know, just sort of tell us what you think is going on and we will help you refine your thoughts, okay? But don't sort of start second guessing yourself and thinking, I'm doing really badly, I've got all this wrong, oh, I've made so many mistakes, right? They must think I'm an idiot. No, 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 no. Okay, none of that stuff will be true. Honestly, I've only ever encountered one bad interview performance in hundreds of interviews, only one that was actually bad. So that the likelihood is that your interview will be exceptionally good, but there will be many exceptionally good interviewees, and therefore it'll be a choice between good and exceptionally good, and that's why it's so difficult to pick. Incidentally, in case you're interested, the reason that this one interview was bad was because the interviewee abused me and my partner for the whole interview. So, you know, verbally abused us. So from the start, he was just incredibly rude and mocking. It was very strange. I don't quite know what he was doing. So that's the only time when I thought that the interview was, you know, it was a genuinely bad performance. So the implication is that you might think within yourself, oh, this is going so terribly, I'm making so many mistakes. Just relax. It's almost certainly not the case. You're being far too hard on yourself in all likelihood. Take a breath and just listen very carefully to the interviewer and they will help you out, okay? So anyway, that's another thing to expect. You will also get questions related to your current study, or you may do. So especially for some subjects that you are currently studying at school. So if, for example, you're applying for mathematics, you could be asked questions that relate to your AS mathematics syllabus, but they will often be coming at it from a slightly different angle. They don't want to make things too predictable or too easy. They want to see how well you can apply your knowledge to unfamiliar territory, okay? But here's an example from English literature. What do you think constitutes good literature? Okay, so the reason this sort of relates to your current studies is because if you're applying to English literature, then you are in all likelihood already studying literature A-level. And so we would think it's reasonable for you to tell us why you're reading certain books or plays and what you think makes some of those good and some of those less good, right? So this is quite a broad conceptual question, and it's trying to gauge what you think quality looks like. Okay, so it's a difficult question, and again, you know, listen carefully to us, work with us, and just tell us honestly what you think makes for a good book, you know, and perhaps you think that a lot of the stuff that we put on reading lists at universities is a load of old rubbish and that we're all snobs and, you know, the reason that we cling on to Shakespeare is completely baffling to you, and that's fine, be honest. Okay, anyway, moving on. There we go, there's Shakespeare, just as an example. As mentioned, you may be asked to apply your knowledge, so you might be asked to apply things you know to unfamiliar contexts. But again, if you're not sure how it applies, we're here to help you out. We're going to work with you on this, all right? So here's an example of how you might try and apply your knowledge. So when might 2 + 2 not equal 4? So this is a question that's been used in the past for mathematics and computer science. When might 2 + 2 not equal 4? Now, how is this applying your knowledge? This looks like a completely baffling question. Well, we'll give you little hints, right? We'll help you out, remember? So I might sort of say something like, when I say something is 2, I'm often just assuming that you and I agree that that is a number in the decimal system. And I might ask you if you know what that means, if you've heard the term decimal, and if you could explain what it means. And you may know, because you've learned it, that decimal refers to numbers that are to the base number 10, okay, hence decimal, right? And so what we're saying here is 2 to base 10 plus 2 to base 10 is equal to 4 to base 10. So one way in which 2 + 2 might not equal 4 is if we fiddle around with the base numbers, which of course is breaking certain rules of maths, but we can just suggest that that's possible. And so 2 to base 2, which is binary, wouldn't even be 2. It would be different numbers, would equal different numbers, right? So it would all sort of get a bit messy. Also, in computer science, 2 + 2, if it's a string, would equal 22. Okay, because you would just be adding the two 2's together, right? Smushing them together. So that's another example where 2 + 2 might not equal 4. Anyway, we would assume that you have bits and pieces of that knowledge, and then we would help you find it and help you put all those pieces together. Okay, so that's how you might be asked to apply your knowledge. All right, we may in some cases ask you to discuss submitted work. So this will apply only to those of you who are submitting work, and you should hopefully know who you are. So it's for subjects like English literature, like history, some of the modern languages degrees as well. And so some of the stuff you will have written in that you might be asked about. Oh, we've got a hand up. Yes.
I'm just going to mute myself because I just don't type. If you were to have an interview and you didn't know the concept or the topic, like how would that? Do I just tell you I don't know, or?
Yeah, absolutely. You tell us you don't know. That's absolutely fine. And don't consider it to be a weakness to say, I don't know what that word means, or I don't understand what you're saying. It's absolutely fine, right? It may be that you've misheard us. It may be that we've used an unfamiliar concept. That's fine, right? Remember, we're recreating how we teach. And in a class, in a tutorial in Oxford, if someone said, I'm sorry, I don't follow what's going on here, I wouldn't sort of think that they were an idiot at all, right? I would help them out. So that's absolutely fine. Indeed, it's a good idea, right? You don't want to sort of pretend like you know what's going on when you actually don't, and you're just sort of struggling and thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know what's going on here. So yeah, I would absolutely ask about that. It's a good question. Thank you for that. Okay, so moving on. Overall, you will basically be assessed on things to do with your knowledge, your understanding, and your intellectual flexibility. Now, this is another thing that's quite important, is that these puzzles usually don't have a single finite answer to them. And so we will be looking for you to answer, to come up with a solution, but also have the capacity to think about other solutions that you're not preferring, and tell us why you don't prefer those other ones. So say, for example, that question on what constitutes good literature, we want you to answer that, right? We do want you to come up with an argument, right? To say, I think good literature is blah, but then we'll say, well, what about if good literature could mean these other things, right? What do you think about that? We want you to be able to discuss those things with an open mind, right? Because that's what happens in teaching in Oxford, right? The puzzles that we're dealing with don't have a right answer most of the time. Even something like maths or physics, where you might imagine there is a solution to a problem, of course, there are multiple ways that you can reach that solution, right? There are multiple ways that you can show you're working and things like that. And so we would want you to discuss various different ways you could attack that problem and tell us why you prefer one over another. So one common mistake that people make is that they're a bit blinkered. They're a bit sort of narrow-minded. They don't want to acknowledge that there are other possibilities, and they perhaps think it's a sign of weakness to show that degree of intellectual flexibility. So it's a bit of a tough tightrope walk to walk here, because you don't want to be too Sorry, my son's coming in. Just bear with me a second. Where was I? Yeah, so I was saying it's quite a tough tightrope to walk, because on the one hand, you've got to try and answer the questions, right? So you can't be completely intellectually flexible to the point where you can't conclude, right? If I ask you what is good literature and you go, oh, it could be this, that, the other, and you're just all over the shop and you can't answer at all, that wouldn't be effective. But at the same time, you don't want to say good literature is this, boom, and there's nothing else, right? Where you're so sort of fixed and rigid. That's also not great. So what you want is a bit of a compromise where you say, I think good literature is this, but I can see it could also be described as that and the other. But here's why, with respect, I would say it's not that or the other, and it is this. I hope that makes sense. Okay, but I've got lots of examples on YouTube. I'll point those out in a second, just so that this all becomes as clear as possible. Okay, so what are we looking for and what are we not looking for? Well, let's have a look. What we do look for, as mentioned, is your academic ability and potential, your subject knowledge where relevant, the application of your knowledge to unfamiliar situations, your motivation to study, your clarity of your reasoning and your capacity for critical thinking, your engagement with us, your ability to listen, and your intellectual flexibility, right? So I've mentioned all of those things that we are looking for. What therefore are we not looking for? So we're not looking for confidence, okay? This is a very common myth about Oxbridge interviews, that we look for people who are very eloquent, who are very self-assured, who are basically very confident. Absolutely not true, right? We have plenty of students who have, say, neurodiversity or who have anxiety. So these are not people that would present as very confident individuals. And that is absolutely not a problem, because it has nothing to do with your academic ability and potential. Okay, so if you're not a particularly confident person, if you don't find it very easy talking to strangers, that's fine, right? And we will try and make you feel as relaxed as possible. Okay, so don't feel like you have to pretend to be somebody that you're not. Just be yourself, all right? Relatedly, we're not looking for people who have exceptional sort of public speaking skills. Yes, we are looking for you to answer the questions. Yes, we're looking for you to be clear in your answers to the questions. But that doesn't mean that you need to have this sort of really extensive vocabulary. It doesn't mean that you need to have a posh accent, obviously. Hopefully that goes without saying, but sometimes people even mask their accents and they wear certain clothes in order to look different. Please, 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 just be yourself, okay? We don't want you to pretend to be somebody that you're not. It's not going to help you get in. And, it's slightly sort of disturbing that some people think that would matter. I can see why they do, because in the past it did matter, about 30, 40 years ago, that stuff did matter, but it certainly doesn't today. We're also not looking for you to give prepared speeches. So again, it can be quite tempting while you're preparing for the interview to think, well, they might ask me about this or they might ask me about that, and to go and sort of come up with some sort of speech that you then are just determined you're going to get through in the interview. That will just lead to you not listening to us, right? And related to that, it's quite tempting for people to just talk out all of the air in the room, right? To just sort of witter, for want of a better word. We get a lot of wittering, we get a lot of waffling. And the problem with that is that you're not working with us, right? You're just talking, and you're trying to show off how much stuff you know, rather than listening and helping develop your thoughts. So when you feel like you've answered the question, you've listened very carefully to the question, you've done what you need to do in the question, you need to stop and you need to let the interviewer back in, okay? If you're talking for sort of 2-3 minutes at a time, that's too long, and you're not giving the interviewers a chance to help you develop the interview. It's a very, very common thing. And honestly, because we want you to succeed, we will typically just butt in and say, okay, let me help. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about that, right? Because we want to make sure you do the right things to get the best performance. But that's another quite common problem, is that people talk too much and they start waffling. Okay, once you feel like you've said enough to answer the question, then stop. And then if the interviewers want more detail, they will ask for it. Okay. We're also not interested in your extracurriculars, so that's anything non-academic. So we're not going to ask you about what position you play in your county rugby team, or anything like that. None of that stuff matters. And so if you don't play county rugby, it's fine, right? So don't worry about that. You're certainly not going to be asked about it. We're also not going to ask you to justify your college choice. It's totally irrelevant to us. So don't worry about anything like that. Okay, so what's up next? So various sort of do's and don'ts for the interview. Do take time before answering. If you blurt out the first thing that comes to your head, interestingly, in sort of psychological theory, that's not you, right? If it's just sort of the first thoughts that get spat out, those are the thoughts of somebody else, right? And we will want to find out what you think on a given topic. Now, it's fine to talk about what others think, but ultimately the interview is all about you, right? So if, for example, I ask you what is good literature, and you blurt out, oh, I read this book about literature, and they say blah, right? I'll say, okay, interesting, but what did you think, right? Because what do you think are the 4 most important words at a university like Oxford? So take a breath and try and take a little bit of time before answering. I'm not talking like 30 seconds, like 2 or 3 seconds, but honestly, if you sort of catch your thoughts, the first things that you want to shout out are probably not your thoughts at all. They're thoughts that somebody else has implanted there. So just think and listen very carefully to the question and start just talking about what's in the question. So for that medicine question about how would you weigh your own head, you can sort of say, right, okay, what do I need to think about here? I need to think about how I weigh something. I need to think about what a head is, right? And if you say this stuff out loud, then I know that you're working through the puzzle. You're what's called deconstructing it, because you're breaking it down into smaller parts. And that is a very, very sensible way to start an interview. Ask for clarification. So as the person who asked the question just now, sorry, I don't know your name, very helpfully pointed out, if you're not sure of what's going on, you must ask for clarification. It's absolutely not a problem, and it will not be held against you. Start with stuff that you know, that you're confident with, and that can help the interviewer sort of determine what could be helpful and what could be unhelpful. Don't sort of worry if you feel like you don't have what you consider to be sufficient knowledge, okay? We're not judging the interviewees on how much stuff they know. We're judging them on how well they can be taught, okay? So it's not about whether you feel like you have an inadequate knowledge base compared to someone else. That's not what's being judged, okay? Think out loud, as I mentioned, and listen carefully, as I mentioned. I mean, honestly, those 2 words are probably the most useful. In fact, I'm going to zoom in to a preposterous level. Listen. Okay, this carefully. Okay, this. Sorry, I'm going a bit mad now. This is what most students fail to do, right? And that's honestly the biggest source of problems for interviewees, is that they don't listen. And I would say that's true of about 70% of cases. It's very, very common. They second guess me. They feel like they know what I want, and that they don't need to listen to my instructions to give me what I want. No, I'm trying to tell you exactly what I want. Just listen to me, okay? That will honestly be your best advice. Okay, don't panic. Now, if you do panic, if you have a panic attack, then we can rearrange the interview. So obviously, it's easy to say to someone who has an anxiety disorder, for example, don't panic, and they might panic, right? And that's beyond your control. So don't panic about the possibility of you panicking, but honestly, try to stay calm, try to enjoy the interview. I think a lot of people actually, in their feedback, regardless of whether they are admitted or not, say they actually really enjoy the interview, and that's good, right? That's what we hope for, because we're recreating how we teach, and we enjoy our subject, and we're looking for other people who share that passion for it. So try not to go into it thinking, oh my goodness, these are the 25 minutes that will make or break my entire life. These will be the 25 minutes that show whether I'm a valuable human being or not. It will do neither of those things. It cannot possibly. The stakes are just not that high, okay? And if you put that sort of weight on your shoulders, you're bound to impair your performance, right? It's a bit like sports psychology. If someone stepping up to a penalty spot kick is thinking, right, well, this spot kick determines, whether or not I'm a good human, then they're going to miss, aren't they? Because they're going to be so full of nerves, right? And so you just need to go, this is just another kick around the park. This is just another time for me to chat about something I love. And take it as easy as you possibly can. Don't speechify, as I've mentioned already. Don't worry if you're cut off. So remember, I'm going to try and help you. And if I think you're not helping yourself, I will jump in and say, okay, but what about this? And don't worry, that's not something where I'll think, well, I had to interrupt them and say, I'm going to give them a big black mark next to their name. No. And don't judge yourself. Almost everyone comes out of the interviews thinking that it was a disaster. And honestly, as I said, in hundreds and hundreds of past interviews, there's only one that has ever been a disaster. And that was because the young man thought that he was, entitled to be incredibly rude to me and my partner. So provided you don't do that, it's very unlikely that you'll do badly at all. Okay. So when and where? So in terms of the sort of logistics, well, I mean, you can get quite a lot with regard to Oxford interviews if you just go on a search engine and look for it. You can, of course, visit our website. Same will apply to Cambridge. We've got all sorts of online resources. There's lots of stuff on YouTube in particular from both universities that sort of mock interviews and whatnot. My own YouTube channel, Jesus College Oxford, has a lot of mock interviews and videos a bit like this, although not exactly like this, because as mentioned at the start, I didn't want to just repeat stuff that we'd done before. But this is because I want to just open source all of this information. Some people are lucky enough to have privileged sort of backgrounds, to have connections with people that have been to Oxbridge, and they tend to get a lot of support. And I want to make sure that everyone gets that support, because it just means that we get better interviews and it just seems fairer. So I've basically tried to just open source as much of the information as I possibly can. So if you go onto YouTube and you search for Jesus College Oxford, you should find a playlist and you should find all sorts of resources that will hopefully be of some use there. Again, as mentioned, this is not just for those of you applying to Jesus College Oxford, it's for those of you applying to any Oxford college or indeed to Cambridge or medical school. So please take a look at that and hopefully it will be of some use. Right. So there we go. I finished with the slides and now I will happily take any questions that you have. But thank you so much for listening. And yeah, thanks. How are we doing for questions?
Thanks, Matt. We haven't got any questions in the chat at the moment, so but I'm sure they will come in now. We'll give everybody a few minutes, but thank you for that. That was a really comprehensive guide, I think, to preparing for your interviews.
No problem. If, by the way, your questions are, can you give me an example question from X subject? That's fine. I'll try my best. How long would the interview be? Yeah, good question, Owen. So they usually last up to about half an hour on average. Can be a little bit shorter than that. You may be invited to multiple interviews at different colleges, and that can mean various different scenarios, so don't read anything into it. If you're invited to several colleges, that doesn't mean that you've failed at your first college. It can mean one of about 5 different scenarios, so I would just go with it. Don't read anything into it. Same with interview length. Don't sort of say, oh, my interview was 27 minutes and yours was 29 minutes, that must mean that I've been rejected. No, it can mean all sorts of things. So just go with it would be my advice. But you should get quite precise details, because obviously it's a bit of an intrusion into your life, right? We're asking you to take some time out to talk to us, and obviously we don't want to be completely inconveniencing you. So you should have very clear instructions as to what to expect when you hear from your college. Okay, but thanks for that question. It's a great one. And thanks for breaking the seal as well. People always get a bit nervous to ask the first question, so I appreciate that. We've got a hand up. Yeah, please.
Don't know your name, sorry, because it's just coming up on my screen as OL17. So if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, so you know how you have 2 interviews, one with the college and one with your subject choice. What does the procedure go like in the college interview?
So that's only true of some Cambridge colleges. We don't do that at Oxford. At Oxford, you may have 2 interviews, but they will all be academic. You won't ever have a college interview. So I'm afraid I don't know terribly well. I think that's the sort of thing that you would need to check on the Cambridge website and check on YouTube. They should hopefully have some examples, but I'm sorry, I'm afraid that's not something that we operate in Oxford.
Right.
A couple of questions.
They may ask.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
We've had a couple of questions come in. So we got For admissions tests that have been cancelled for technical issues, will the interview become more important to overall admission?
Yes, is the short answer. And my sincere apologies for the technical problems on those tests. That was a real fiasco, to be blunt. And yes, I think it's only reasonable that more weight is therefore going to have to be placed on conducting more interviews than would be typical. Yeah.
We've also been asked, can we have an example of a question for music, please?
Yeah, that's quite a fun question for music, which is, if you could invent a new musical instrument, what sound would it make?
Lovely.
Now, yeah, it's a nice one, isn't it? I mean, sort of buried in that question, not terribly subtly, is a bigger question about what even music is, right? And, what's the difference between sound, noise, and music, right? At what point is, for example, scratching nails on a blackboard just a horrible noise, but could you make that musical somehow? It's not unusual for some of the questions to be about the discipline itself. What do you actually think it is we're doing here? So remember that question example from English literature, what makes good literature? That's a really important disciplinary question, right? Because if you're going to study literature, do you know what makes for good literature, right? And do you know what English students do day in, day out? So it's not a bad idea to have a think about what it is you're going into before you do it. So when I did interviews for history and politics, for example, in Oxford, I would ask them, what's the difference between history and politics? Which is a really awkward, difficult question. And the temptation is to say something like, oh, I don't know, politics is just history that happened more recently. To which my follow-up question will be, how much more recently? So it's, have a bit of a think about what your discipline is, but don't worry about finding the answer to that, because there isn't one.
So PPE has 3 interviews. Would I have to travel to Oxford for each of the interviews?
No, you won't travel to Oxford for any of the interviews. So Oxford interviews are all going to be online. So please do not travel to Oxford. You're better off working out whether you could stay at home or go to school for your interview, and which would be better in terms of your, whether you'll find a quiet place and whether you have the right connectivity and you have the right devices. So no, please do not come to Oxford.
Well, actually, no, please go to Oxford at some point because it's lovely and you need to walk around, but not for the interview.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Quite a long one here, so apologies. So if our written work is quite detailed in an A-level, which is less related to our course, how much will it be discussed in the interview? For example, they've got bio, which I'm assuming is biology A-level, and law specifically.
So, yeah, I mean, it's typical that if you are asked about submitted work, it would be something related to your course. If it's not directly related to the course you're applying for, they might ask you something about, the general approach to writing. So they might ask you about how you structured your thoughts or how you put the thoughts together. But they wouldn't, for example, ask you about the technicalities of biology if you're applying for law, because obviously that wouldn't provide them with terribly useful information. So I think they might ask you sort of more generally about how you write or how you put that together, but that's a bit of a guess, I'm afraid.
And that has been asked as well in a slightly different way. Is it likely that the interview will assess skills that would have been demonstrated in exams other than the ones that you're taking? But I think you've just answered that perfectly, so I think we can skip that. So an example of a biochemistry interview question has been asked for, and also a fine art question.
Oh, crikey. Okay, so biochemistry, there was a question in the past asking about 3 different chemicals and asking which is likely to be the most soluble. So hang on, it's a graphical question, so I'll need to pull out the graphic. So just bear with me for a second. Here it is. So, okay, hopefully you can see a slide from PowerPoint, and so there's 3 chemicals on the screen. One is silver chloride at the top, then table salt, NaCl, and then it's copper sulfate hydrate or something like that at the bottom. And so the question is, which is the most soluble, and give your reasons. And the answer is the bottom one. And you would need to explain your reasons. And I suppose sort of intuitively, I'm no biochemist, obviously, the shorter chain of molecules and the greater simplicity in the bonding is what makes it easier to dissolve in water, something like that. Anyway, there you go, there's an example. There's a fun one from fine art, which is the Mona Lisa overrated? Which is an interesting one. The Mona Lisa was famously stolen. And that's part of what makes it so made it so famous, because everyone was looking for it for a while, and that's part of what made it so valuable. So it could be that we don't necessarily rate the artwork on its own merits, but we rate it based on fads and fashions and sort of slightly dubious things like that. It's also quite likely in fine art that you're asked about the portfolio that you submit. So related to being asked about submitted work, that's something that could very likely come up.
Okay, thank you, Matt. That sounds like an interesting question to answer. If the subject has multiple interviews, would they be on the same day or different days?
Could be both, actually. So you need to be sort of relatively flexible with your timing. Sometimes interviews can be arranged at fairly short notice, so just be aware of that possibility. I mean, obviously, we want to make sure that you can attend the interviews, and we want to make sure that things aren't too inconvenient for you, but it is possible that you could have multiple interviews on one day, yes.
Okay. Oh, this will test you now. Can we have an example of a question in a Spanish interview, please?
Okay, I'm going to have to look up my big bank of interview questions. And I can send these to you, Karen, and you can share them with everyone if
that would be great. Yes, please, and I can send them out to students. That would be fantastic.
So I don't have one for Spanish, I don't think, but let's have a look. I've got some for modern languages more generally. Sorry, bear with me. Oh, well, here we go. This one for Spanish. Compare and contrast Spanish and Portuguese, which might be a bit tricky if you've never studied Portuguese. Does language define our identity? That's quite fun. What else we got? How would you improve Google Translate? What's the quickest way to learn a language? Should we learn the swear words of another language? Quite like that one. There you go. Quite a few to think about there.
There's a few to think about. Yeah, definitely. What about the maths interview now then? I think it's just gone, or somebody's coming.
So maths.
Yeah, is it talking about maths concepts or more working out maths problems?
So it's usually working out maths problems, right? Because the concepts is more likely to be testing your knowledge, whereas the problems is testing your skills, and we tend to lean more towards skills. So we do have an example maths interview on the YouTube channel, so go and check that. In fact, we've got a few maths interview questions there, so do check those out. For maths and for some subjects in that sort of ballpark, the STEM subjects, it's quite likely that we'll ask you to use an online whiteboard, and we use what's called Miro, M-I-R-O, and it's very straightforward and intuitive. You get sent a link, and then you get access to the same shared whiteboard as the interviewers, and then they might ask you to share your working basically on this sort of shared whiteboard, just like we might have done back in the old days when you would be in person, ask you to write on a whiteboard. We'll just ask you to do the same thing. It's quite a good idea to have a look at Miro in advance, just to sort of get familiar with how it works. It's all very straightforward, but just so that it's not the first time you're ever using it is on the time you actually have your interview. It's a good idea. But as mentioned, you'll be given all of the instructions on what to expect and what devices you might need in advance. Obviously, we're not assuming that you own particular devices, so we will ask, whether you have access to things at school or college or what have you. So yeah, but that's a good question.
Yeah, and usually most of the interviews now seem to take place at school or college because they do have access to those, and if anything goes wrong, there's usually people there to sort that out. But yeah, that's a good idea. I'll send that round on my row.
Sorry, it was a situation where the children are being suspiciously quiet, so I had to investigate.
I don't like those situations, to be honest. I don't blame you. Okay, so we've got two more, and then we've got a hands up, and we'll see how we go. So, will the interview assess skills that would have been demonstrated in exams that have since been cancelled? like language aptitude in the classics course?
Oh, so because the test was cancelled, will they? They could do. I mean, so it's not unusual for some similar styles of tests to cross over from the admissions test to the interview. But I absolutely can't guarantee it. I'm afraid that every college and every tutor at every college will interview slightly differently. We have a framework that we have to stick to, so we're not going completely off different scripts, but I can't sort of say definitively what you'll get in a classics interview. So just be prepared for anything, I'm afraid.
I couldn't find the other Pokemon. Call this one. It's missing.
Okay, can you ask Teddy?
You're going to do this
Sorry.
slide. See? Slide.
Sorry.
No problem. I understand the challenge of Pokemon. I think this might be the last question now, because it is coming up very late at night, and I'm sure everybody's been in school all day and is tired. But we have got one question here. Understands that we should think about our answers before speaking aloud, but how quickly should they share their initial thought process? They're very worried or wary of hesitating for too long.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I suppose all I would suggest against is just allowing the very instantaneous thought that jumps into your head to just come tumbling out of your mouth, because that is what I suspect will not be you, right? That'll be something that has been implanted. And fine, it could be that it has been helpfully implanted. So if after you have that initial, that initial sort of thought, you start to sort of ponder, well, actually, maybe there could be something to that, fine, just say it. What I would say is, you don't want to pause for any longer than 5 seconds. But honestly, 5 seconds is eons in brain chemistry, eons. Okay, what your brain tends to do is think almost instantaneously, and that is where it'll be something that's been baked in there by somebody else. So as I say, just take a breath, think very carefully about the question, think about the individual words in the question, and start sort of saying out loud. And if you say out loud, well, I was taught this thing, is that helpful here? That's really useful, because then the interviewers can say, oh, that's interesting, tell me more. Or they can say, oh, actually, I think I was more inclined towards something else, and they can take you in the right direction. So when you do sort of take a bit of time to think, make it no more than 5 seconds, basically.
Lovely. And there's no other questions come in. So on that note, I would like to say thank you to Matt for giving up his evening. It's much appreciated. You do so much for Seren, and you've given yet again so much useful information for students, so thank you for that. And some of you students I probably won't see before you, fingers crossed, get your offers of interviews. So good luck to all of you, and I hope that you get the interviews that you want. But thank you, Matt.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone for turning out tonight. And yeah, we're all rooting for you, so best of luck. But don't forget, if you're not invited, you're still heroes, so just don't worry about it. All right, but thank you so much for coming on. All right, all the best. Have a good evening.
And you, Matt, enjoy.
Cheers. Bye now.
Bye.